each experience of sexual trauma and violence is, of course, unique. And then depending on each person's pre-existing experience in life, what and how the symptoms that they will then be presenting to treatment with, of course, vary significantly. So I wanted to put together a series of domains of impact to kind of help us to get started about the gestalt of experience and the myriad symptoms that survivors will likely be coming into session with, many of which they may not even be able to articulate or point to in terms of direct impact in their relationships or their sex lives. So much of any traumatic experience influences all of the domains of who we are. But we don't always have that vocabulary. So the first thing that I like to talk about with survivors is really their experience of impact, and talking, of course, about, what are their goals, and really letting them lead the charge on this, because as trauma-informed professionals, we certainly don't want to assume trauma or assume impact if the client is not experiencing that. However, I find that with a lot of psychoeducation, survivors start to recognize all of the different nuanced symptoms that maybe aren't so big and bold in their direct vision every day. And it is a lot of those little layers that tend to interrupt healthy sexual experiences and hot intimacy, either with themselves or with a partner. So I took a lot of the meat of this out because we are kind of short on time, but if you do want to look more in depth about these different domains of impact, you can check out on my YouTube channel, which is just Modern Intimacy on YouTube. And I go into significant depth about how sexual trauma impacts identity, neurobiology, so the brain and body connection, cognitions and the way survivors think, emotional regulation, of course, mental health experiences, behavioral consequences, legal and financial consequences, social, meaning friends and family, and then of course romantic relationships. And then last but not least, sexuality. And our sexuality is influenced by all of these other domains of our lives. So to just focus on sex, in my opinion, is to treat the long-term implications of sexual trauma in kind of a compartmentalized and reductionistic way, because how we see ourselves, of course, influences how we show up sexually. Whether or not we can pay our rent is going to influence how our sexual behavior is accessible to us, or whether or not we feel obliged to barter sexuality for survival, financial or relational. And so there's a lot of overlap, and I'll encourage you to kind of think about, when you're talking with survivors and or their partners, to explore a little bit more in depth how they experience these different aspects of their lives being impacted by sexual trauma, and what, if any, of those impacts are important to them to, of course, examine more closely or address more robustly with goals.